Our next segment covers two stories that we've clumped together under a common theme, and this is to do with the treatment of artifacts by museums. One story coming from BBC News, the BBC News website, Norway's Kon-Tiki Museum to return Easter Island artifacts, and the other story coming from CNN with a headline of Italy to return hundreds of cultural relics back to China. Now, on the face of it, this is part of what is increasingly a trend, certainly in European and I suppose you could say, broadly speaking, Western museums, to reassess their relationship with the material culture that they have in their archives and in their collections and also on display, and whether or not they have a right, a current right, to have those museums in their archives. It's also actually part of a trend to respond to people's requests to have material culture back that they consider to have been stolen or taken under pretenses that weren't entirely honest or open. And so, in that sense, you know, we've lumped these two together, and you've sort of requested that we do this. Is this because this is something that you can get behind? Is this, you know, is this something that you want to highlight as best practice, or?
It's not something I want to highlight as best practice. It's something I want to highlight because it raises a number of very interesting questions that I think have to be considered when we're talking about all these issues of museology and cultural appropriation.
Museology, that's a good word.
Yeah, and who are the most appropriate custodians for material culture, particularly when it's someone else's material culture.
Yeah.
The first one is the Kon-Tiki Museum in Oslo, which is there to celebrate the life and work of the Norwegian soldier and explorer Thor Heyerdahl, who certainly when I was growing up in the 1960s was a big hero. I made a model of the Kon-Tiki raft after watching his story on Blue Peter, and that was his attempt to show that people could have travelled from South America to the Pacific Islands and colonised the Pacific Islands.
Mm-hmm.
We now know that's wrong. He should have been going in the opposite direction.
But it was a heck of a feat of experimental archaeology, though.
It was designed as experimental archaeology to explore a theory that was current at the time, so it was absolutely valid.
Yeah.
And to sail an open balsa wood raft 3,500 miles across the Pacific is a pretty major achievement of courage and seamanship, so no one would knock that.
Mm-hmm.
What this is about, though, is as part of his research to suggest that people from South America could have colonised the Pacific Islands, he did excavations on Rapa Nui and took material back to Norway.
Right.
Now, the museum that was set up to commemorate to mark and commemorate his work in Oslo are now returning that material, or some of that material, to Chile, which is the governing power who have control over Rapa Nui.
So is that it done and dusted then?
Except that it's not, because if you read the what's going on, it's being done at a government level. But and then Thor Heyerdahl's son, who's also called Thor Heyerdahl, says the repatriation is a fulfillment of my father's promise to the Rapa Nui authorities. I'm going to say Rapa Nui. Some people might know it as Easter Island, but the modern term we tend to use is Rapa Nui.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But the objects should be returned after they've been analysed and published. And that was a quote from Agence France Presse. And the director of the museum is a man called Martin Beale, said, our common interest is that the objects are returned and above all delivered to a well-equipped museum. And that covers one of the big arguments about keeping this material in, is that we can't be sure how well it's going to be curated if we hand it over.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We have to make sure that it's there available for scholars and people to observe in perpetuity as far as it's possible to predict.
Yeah.
But then he adds, and this is the crucial thing, and this is the wriggle room, he says the whole process will, quote, take time.
Okay.
So we're at the beginning of a process. The Chilean culture minister is quoted as saying, as a ministry, we have a mission to respond to the just demand of Rapa Nui, to the Rapa Nui people to recover their cultural heritage. And you were making the point that the British Museum's involved in this as well, weren't you?
Well, actually, the BBC article here does a really good job of linking to a related story from November 2018, where Rapa Nui were requesting the return of what they describe as a stolen friend, one of the Moai statues, which is housed in the museum. And it's interesting that this all has, in that sense, this has a much closer echo of the Parthenon marbles, or the so-called Elgin marbles, in so much as here we have a museum in Norway doing seemingly what the British Museum is unwilling or unable to do. And I suppose that's what I mean, in so much as this is interesting and probably laudable, but it's also interesting that, as you say, there are provisions for it taking time and for there being things in place, and it's so. Is that what you can get behind then? Is that what the best practice element of it?
I can get behind that if there's a mutual agreement. Where I have a problem is I don't believe we should be breaking up the collections of the great Enlightenment museums like the British Museum, the Louvre, the Prado, the Hermitage, the Pergamon, and all those others. Because I think they still have a major cultural value. You only have to look at the range of ethnicities and languages you bump into every day in the British Museum to see that it's not a white colonial outpost anymore, or if it is, it's one that people of many different ethnicities and cultures want to visit.
Well, that's interesting. I suppose you can definitely argue this as a resident, essentially, of Greater London in that sense. Or are you in Central London? I'm never quite sure.
If I left home now, I could be at the British Museum in under an hour.
Okay, there you go. So you're close enough that actually you're able to obviously observe that demographic of people who are visiting, but also there is this interesting argument to be made that in a city like London, there is an international hub that also has a tremendously diverse population. That actually the British Museum represents something that people can draw on to justify wherever they've come from in the world, and think about wherever they come from in the world in terms of their own histories as well. It's interesting that if the British Museum simply only had British stuff in it, all of those people, apart from the Brits, would feel that this was just relevant to the Brits. So I suppose there is that argument to be made, I guess, in terms of the people who are able to access this and think about it from various angles in one place. But what do you make of the other story that we've highlighted in this bundle, the Italy returning hundreds of cultural relics back to China?
Well, again, this is a really interesting one. And before we move on to that, I just want to say very quickly, I realised that the argument about the collections of institutions like the British Museum is a very complex one, and we're not going to deal with it in a 15-minute segment on Watching Brief.
No.
So I would have many more things to say if we were talking about it for longer, and I'm sure many of our colleagues.
One day we should actually. But maybe one day we should actually. I would love to have maybe that could be like a live stream. That could be fun, couldn't it?
Yes.
Invite people to talk to us. Maybe get some guests on. That could be fun.
I think. Well, let's park that idea, but park it in a place where we can get at it, because I think that's a really let's go there.
Okay. Yeah.
The second question, and both these, they're on one level good news stories. This one's about a heritage crime story that's come good, but there are nuances like the Kon-Tiki story where maybe things are a little more shades of grey.
Okay.
This is a story that broke at towards the end of March. About 800 artifacts from China, dating from the Neolithic down to the end of the Ming Dynasty in the 1660s, which had been seized by the Italian authorities because they've been illegally exported from China.
Right.
So basically we're dealing with heritage crime. We're dealing with the proceeds of crime, which is being returned to the place where it came from. That is a good thing, and that should happen wherever it is identified.
Yeah.
And quite understandably, and again, perhaps pour encourager les autres, this was flagged up in the media. There was a photo call with Italian and Chinese diplomats and so on, showing this material being returned. It was being returned on a court order. An Italian court in Milan ordered the seized material to be returned to the Chinese authorities. So again, all absolutely proper. Where it gets slightly more interesting and perhaps slightly more shades of grey is that at the moment the right-wing Italian coalition government against the advice and wishes of many of its international partners, including in the European Union, is becoming actively involved with an initiative from the Chinese government called Belt and Road, which is basically the Chinese government exporting, literally and figuratively, its influence and economy into infrastructure projects to link China to Europe. And in fact, a few months ago, there was a train that had travelled all the way from China to this country.
Well, it's being described as a reinvigoration of the ancient Silk Roads, for example.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. It happens to be the Silk Road with one of the, well, perhaps the world's largest, certainly most influential economy at the moment. This is, the Chinese are currently building Britain's nuclear power stations, for example. It's another part of the same initiative, or at least part of the same economic aim. It's exporting Chinese political power through the Chinese economic power. And this is there are implications.
So are you sort of saying this is cultural window dressing on a broader economic international relationship?
This is we've heard of greenwashing. This is culture washing.
Pot washing.
Pot washing, indeed. Yeah. This is dressing up, wanting to curry favour with the Chinese government with a perfectly legal and justifiable piece of heritage crime fighting.
So it's extraordinarily convenient for everyone involved in that.
It was incredibly convenient for everyone involved.
Okay, interesting. So, well, there you go. Okay, but just as we bring this segment to a close, then, do you think then that there's an argument to be made that it's a slightly cynical argument, but that these sorts of relationships between the old Enlightenment museums and the rest of the world could be mitigated and mediated for almost, I suppose, current political greasing of wheels? I mean, should we be doing that?
Put it this way: if the Greek government was suddenly the most powerful economy in the Western world and joined the G7 and so on, and Britain on its own outside the European Union wanted a favourable trade deal, guess what they'd ask for first?
Yeah. Well, and also guess what we'd be gift wrapping? Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, interesting. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay.